December 264 BC, the Forum Boreum stank of cattle dung and smoke. But on this morning, something darker perfumed the air. 3 pairs of slaves stood shackled in the marketplace, their hands wrapped around unfamiliar weapons, their eyes searching the crowd for mercy they would never find. The sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Sceva had gathered Rome's elite not to mourn their father with prayers or statues, but to honor him with something far more primal. Blood. This wasn't entertainment, not yet. This was duty, an ancient obligation called munus, a debt owed to the restless dead. The Campanians had done it for generations, slitting throats over graves to quiet vengeful spirits. The Samnites, Rome's old enemies, had refined it into ritual combat, and now Rome's aristocracy embraced the custom with terrifying enthusiasm. As iron met flesh that December day, as the first gladiator crumpled onto stones, still warm from the morning sun, no one in that blood-splattered marketplace could have imagined what they'd unleashed. A tradition born from grief was about to become Rome's most addictive poison, a spectacle that would consume empires, bankrupt treasuries, and turn human suffering into the empire's favorite pastime. The transformation happened slowly, like rot spreading through marble. By the 3rd century BC, what began as funeral rites had metastasized into state policy. Religious festivals dedicated to Jupiter suddenly featured armed combat between the hymns and offerings. The Senate called it piety, but the truth was far more calculated. These fights could do something prayers never could. They could command loyalty through fear and fascination. The armor told its own brutal story. Early gladiators wore the shapes of Rome's conquered enemies, the Samnite with his heavy rectangular shield, the Thracian with his curved sickle blade, the Gaul with his long slashing sword. Every time a crowd watched these fighters bleed out on the sand, they were watching Rome's victories replayed in miniature, each death a reminder of who held the power. Temporary wooden stands gave way to permanent stone amphitheaters, temples built not to gods but to violence itself. By 80 AD, when Emperor Titus inaugurated the Colosseum, the transformation was complete. What had started as 3 pairs of slaves dying in a cattle market had evolved into an industrial complex of death, capable of processing thousands of victims in a single day. The architects of these arenas understood something profound and terrible about human nature. They knew that spectacle could replace bread, that watching suffering could satisfy hunger better than any meal. The wooden benches filled with senators and slaves alike, all united in their appetite for blood. Vendors hawked wine and olives, while below, in tunnels that reeked of fear and animal waste, handlers prepared the day's entertainment. Lions starved until their ribs pressed through matted fur, panthers driven mad by confinement. Elephants, those walking monuments to Hannibal's failed invasion, now reduced to targets for spears and arrows. And somewhere in the darkest cells, prisoners waited, knowing their deaths wouldn't be quick or dignified but choreographed, turned into theater for a crowd that had learned to find poetry in agony. If you're still watching, if this glimpse into Rome's heart of darkness has gripped you, then hit subscribe, because we're only beginning to uncover how deep this cruelty ran. The stories that follow will show you not just what Rome did, but why an entire civilization came to crave suffering the way others crave music or art. Every click, every like, helps us preserve these dark chapters of history, the ones that make us uncomfortable precisely because they reveal what humanity is capable of when power goes unchecked. Now, let's descend deeper into the nightmare, because what came next makes those early funeral games look almost merciful by comparison. By midday, when the morning-esque gladiatorial bouts had soaked the sand crimson, and the crowd's bloodlust had been temporarily sated, the arena shifted into something even more grotesque. The Romans called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, but that clinical phrase couldn't capture the theatrical horror that unfolded. This wasn't execution, it was performance art written in screams and entrails. Criminals, deserters, Christians who refused to renounce their faith, all became unwilling actors in Rome's most depraved passion plays. During Emperor Trajan's victory celebrations after conquering Dacia in 106 AD, the festivities stretched across 103 days. Historians estimate that thousands died in that span, their deaths paced like acts in an endless tragedy, each one designed to keep the audience hungry for the next. The logistics alone reveal Rome's commitment to industrialized cruelty. Exotic animals had to be trapped across 3 continents and transported in conditions that often killed them before they reached the city. Yet still they came crocodiles from the Nile, leopards from the Caucasus, even giraffes from regions so remote that Romans had never seen such creatures and called them camelopards, unable to comprehend what their empire had dragged into the light. But the true genius of Roman cruelty wasn't in the killing itself, it was in the meaning they forced upon it. Prisoners weren't simply thrown to lions, they were costumed and scripted, made to reenact myths where the endings had been rewritten in blood. A man condemned for theft might be dressed as Orpheus, the legendary musician who could tame wild beasts with song. The crowd would watch him stand alone with a lyre, perhaps even begin to play, before a bear was released to maul him to death. The poet Martial recorded this exact scene from the Colosseum's inauguration in 80 AD, noting with dark irony that this Orpheus failed to charm the animals as the myth promised. Another prisoner might be cast as Daedalus, suspended on crude mechanical wings before plummeting into a pit of predators. The myth celebrated human ingenuity and escape, but Rome's version celebrated only the inevitability of imperial justice. The most disturbing of all was reserved for women. Prisoners forced to reenact the myth of Persippu, who, according to legend, desired a bull. What followed was public degradation that blurred execution, humiliation, and pornography into something Rome's own writers struggled to describe without flinching. The architects of suffering didn't stop at beasts and myths. Fire became another medium for Rome's artistic cruelty. The tunica molesta was a shirt soaked in pitch and sulfur, and prisoners wearing it were set ablaze to become living torches. Emperor Nero was particularly fond of this spectacle, using these human candles to illuminate his garden parties while he performed poetry for guests who dared not look away. Tertullian, an early Christian writer who watched his own people burned this way, called them living torches and condemned an empire that could transform murder into mood lighting. Crucifixion, borrowed from the East and perfected by Roman efficiency, was staged right inside the arena, prisoners nailed to timber while children played nearby and vendors sold refreshments as if death on display was as ordinary as a market day. Not everyone in Rome celebrated this descent into choreographed madness. The philosopher Seneca confessed that attending the midday executions hardened his soul, stripping away his humanity rather than reinforcing any sense of justice. He wrote that watching men killed for entertainment made him crueler, more callous to suffering, and he warned that Rome was poisoning itself with its own appetite for blood. Yet his warnings went unheeded, drowned out by the roar of 50,000 voices demanding more, always more. The games became Rome's addiction, an empire-wide sickness that no philosopher's wisdom could cure. By the reign of Commodus in the late 2nd century, the line between ruler and performer had dissolved entirely. This emperor, who fancied himself Hercules reborn, would stride into the Colosseum dressed in lion skin, slaughtering hundreds of animals that had been crippled beforehand to guarantee his victory. He forced senators to watch and applaud, bleeding the imperial treasury dry to fund performances that satisfied only his own fractured ego. When critics whispered that the emperor had lost his mind, they weren't wrong, but they missed the larger truth. Commodus wasn't an aberration. He was the logical conclusion of what Rome had become, a civilization so drunk on spectacle that it elevated a madman simply because he gave them the bloodiest show they'd ever seen. The Colosseum still stands today, its stones bleached by sun and scoured by centuries of rain. But if you walk through those tunnels where prisoners once waited for their scripted deaths, you can almost hear the echoes, not just of violence but of something worse, the sound of an entire civilization convincing itself that cruelty was entertainment, that suffering was art, that watching human beings torn apart by beasts or burned alive could somehow be justified as justice or piety or tradition. Rome's arenas weren't just stages for death, they were laboratories where an empire experimented with how much darkness the human soul could absorb and still call itself civilized. The answer, written in the sand and bones beneath the Colosseum, is more than any society should ever tolerate. That's the true horror Rome left behind, not just the bodies that fed the sand for centuries, but the proof that entire populations could be trained to cheer for atrocity, to bring their children to watch torture, to find community and shared identity in the systematic destruction of human dignity. The games ended not because Rome found its conscience, but because the empire collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. The Colosseum fell silent, not from moral awakening but from bankruptcy and invasion, the spectacle finally devouring the civilization that created it. So here's what we're left to wrestle with, sitting comfortably in our modern world, watching this story unfold on screens instead of sand. If tens of thousands of Romans, people who built aqueducts and wrote philosophy and created law codes we still study, could be conditioned to crave such suffering, what does that say about the darkness lurking in any society that stops questioning its entertainments? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror held up to every civilization that's ever confused power with virtue, spectacle with meaning, and the roar of the crowd with the voice of justice. The stones of the Colosseum, remember, even if we'd rather forget.